There is a profound silence that descends upon alliance headquarters when diplomats realize that the institutional frameworks binding nations together for generations have quietly dissolved, not through formal dissolution or dramatic rupture, but through the steady accumulation of diverging interests that render shared commitments meaningless. It is not the visible break of treaties torn apart or alliances publicly abandoned, but the invisible erosion of trust and alignment that occurs when partners recognize their futures lie in different directions and that maintaining pretenses serves neither party's interests. We are hearing that silence now in the corridors of NATO headquarters, in the conference rooms where transatlantic policy coordination once occurred seamlessly, and in the capitals of European nations where leaders are making calculations about their security and prosperity that increasingly exclude or contradict American preferences. What we are witnessing is not merely European frustration with specific American policies or temporary friction over burden sharing and trade issues. It is the fundamental reordering of the transatlantic relationship that has been the cornerstone of Western power since 1945, the quiet European recognition that alignment with Washington no longer serves European interests in a multipolar world, and the emergence of European strategic autonomy that represents the death of American hegemony over the most economically developed and technologically sophisticated region outside North America. For decades, I have studied alliance politics, the conditions under which partnerships endure or dissolve, and the historical patterns by which junior partners in asymmetric alliances eventually pursue independence when the benefits of subordination no longer justify the costs of constrained autonomy. And I tell you now that we are witnessing one of those rare historical transformations when the entire architecture of international order shifts, when relationships that appeared permanent reveal themselves as contingent arrangements that serve purposes no longer relevant to contemporary realities. The assumption that has guided American foreign policy since the Marshall Plan, that European security and prosperity depend fundamentally on American protection and leadership, that European nations would subordinate their particular interests to broader transatlantic solidarity, and that the North Atlantic Alliance would remain the organizing principle of European strategic orientation, has been systematically undermined by developments over the past decade that have forced European leaders to recognize that their continent's future lies in arrangements that do not depend on American reliability or align with American objectives. Europe is not formally breaking with Washington through dramatic announcements or treaty withdrawals. It is quietly constructing alternative frameworks for security cooperation, economic integration, and diplomatic coordination that operate independently of American preferences and increasingly in defiance of American pressure. If you value understanding how alliances actually function and dissolve rather than accepting the official rhetoric that obscures fundamental shifts behind diplomatic language, if you refuse to believe that institutions persist simply because they existed in the past, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The algorithm suppresses this analysis because it contradicts narratives about Western unity that serve American institutional interests in maintaining influence over allies whose compliance can no longer be assumed. Do not let them keep you ignorant about the transformation that is reshaping global power and ending the era of American dominance over the most valuable alliance relationships that underwrote post-war American hegemony. We are looking at the culmination of fractures that have been developing for years but have accelerated dramatically since the Trump administration shattered the pretense that American leadership serves European interests rather than demanding European subordination to American preferences. The withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement over unanimous European objection, the imposition of secondary sanctions that forced European companies to choose between Iranian markets and American financial systems, the threats of tariffs on European steel and automobiles, the public humiliation of European leaders at summits, the demands for increased defense spending framed as Europeans freeloading on American protection, these actions revealed to European publics and elites alike that the transatlantic relationship had transformed from partnership into domination, where American presidents felt entitled to override European sovereignty and European leaders were expected to comply regardless of how such compliance undermined their domestic legitimacy or their nation's interests. The Biden administration attempted to restore transatlantic harmony through rhetorical emphasis on shared values and multilateral consultation, But the underlying dynamics driving European autonomy have only intensified because those dynamics reflect structural realities rather than personal relationships between leaders. The Ukraine conflict initially appeared to reinforce transatlantic unity as European nations rallied to support Kyiv and coordinate sanctions against Moscow in alignment with American policy. But the longer the conflict has persisted, the more clearly European and American interests have diverged in ways that are forcing European leaders to make choices between continued alignment with Washington and pursuit of outcomes that serve European security and economic interests. European nations are bearing the primary economic costs of the Ukraine conflict through energy price spikes that have devastated industrial competitiveness, through the burden of hosting millions of refugees, through the risks of escalation that threaten European cities far more directly than American territory, and through the opportunity costs of defense spending, increases that crowd out social investments that maintain political stability. Meanwhile, the United States benefits strategically from European dependence on American energy exports that have replaced Russian gas, from defense contracts as European nations purchase American weapon systems, from the weakening of Russia as a rival without committing American ground forces, and from the reinforcement of European security dependence that appeared to be eroding before the conflict began. This asymmetry of costs and benefits is unsustainable politically within European democracies, where populations are questioning why they should sacrifice living standards and risk nuclear escalation to serve a conflict whose continuation serves American strategic interests more than European security. The economic dimension of transatlantic divergence extends far beyond the immediate impacts of the Ukraine conflict into fundamental questions about Europe's position in the emerging global economy. The Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration passed with great fanfare as climate legislation has functioned as industrial policy designed to attract manufacturing investment away from Europe through subsidies that European nations cannot match under their own fiscal rules. European companies are relocating production to the United States to access subsidies that make American facilities more profitable than European operations, hollowing out the European industrial base in ways that will take decades to rebuild. This is not inadvertent side effect, but deliberate strategy to address American deindustrialization by capturing investment and production capacity from allied nations who lack the leverage to resist economic statecraft that would be condemned as predatory if practiced by China. European leaders initially protested these policies through diplomatic channels, hoping that appeals to alliance solidarity would lead Washington to modify approaches that harm European interests. When those appeals were ignored, European nations began pursuing their own industrial policies that violate the free market principles that the transatlantic relationship supposedly embodies, and more significantly, began exploring economic partnerships with China that offer access to markets and investment capital that can offset losses from American policies. The German automotive industry, the backbone of European manufacturing and a critical source of employment and tax revenue, has bet its future on the Chinese market, where the majority of growth in electric vehicle sales will occur. This strategic dependence on China directly contradicts American demands that European nations decouple from Chinese economic relationships in service of containment strategies that serve American interests in maintaining technological dominance. The choice that European nations face is stark and cannot be avoided through diplomatic formulas that maintain the appearance of transatlantic unity. European economic prosperity increasingly depends on access to Chinese markets, Chinese investment, and integration into supply chains where China plays central roles that cannot be easily replaced. American demands for decoupling would require Europeans to sacrifice economic relationships that are worth hundreds of billions in trade and investment that support millions of jobs, and that will determine whether European companies remain globally competitive in the industries that will define the 21st century economy. The assumption that Europeans would accept such sacrifice to serve American strategic objectives rests on the belief that European leaders value alliance solidarity more than their own political survival, a belief that has no basis in the behavior of democratic politicians facing electorates who care more about employment and living standards than about abstract geopolitical competition. The security dimension reveals even more dramatic transformation in European strategic thinking that challenges the fundamental premises of the NATO alliance. For 70 years, European security policy has rested on the assumption that American extended deterrence, the commitment to defend Europe, including through use of nuclear weapons if necessary, provides more reliable protection than any European alternative could achieve. This assumption has been progressively undermined by developments that force European leaders to question whether American security guarantees remain credible in an era when the United States faces peer competitors who can threaten American territory in ways that the Soviet Union could only theoretically achieve. The French have articulated most explicitly what other European nations think privately, that American willingness to risk New York for Paris is declining as the United States reorients toward the Pacific and as American society becomes more skeptical of overseas commitments. President Macron's statements about European strategic autonomy and the brain death of NATO were dismissed by the foreign policy establishment as gaullist grandstanding, but they reflect serious strategic assessment within French defense planning circles about the reliability of American commitments when those commitments require accepting catastrophic risks to American cities. If China moves against Taiwan and the United States finds itself in military confrontation with a nuclear peer, will American presidents maintain the same level of commitment to European security? Or will resources and attention be diverted to the Pacific in ways that leave Europe exposed to whatever Russia does in the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict? This question is not theoretical abstraction, but practical planning consideration that is driving European defense investments in directions that emphasize autonomy rather than integration with American forces. The development of European fighter aircraft programs that compete with American exports, the investments in missile defense systems that are European rather than purchasing American technology, the discussions about European nuclear deterrence that would reduce dependence on American weapons, these initiatives reflect strategic hedging against the possibility that American commitments will prove unreliable when tested by circumstances that make defending Europe costly or inconvenient for Washington. The institutional manifestation of European autonomy is the proliferation of security frameworks that operate outside NATO structures and that increasingly exclude American participation. The European Defense Fund, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, the European Peace Facility, these initiatives were sold as complementary to NATO that would enhance European capabilities and reduce burden on American forces. In practice, they are building parallel structures that create capacity for independent European action and that establish bureaucratic and industrial foundations for security policies that do not require American approval or participation. The more these structures develop and prove capable of coordinating European responses to security challenges, the less essential NATO becomes to European security and the more the alliance functions as legacy institution maintained for diplomatic reasons rather than operational necessity. The diplomatic dimension completes the picture of European divergence from American preferences across the full spectrum of foreign policy. European nations are pursuing diplomatic engagement with adversaries that Washington has designated for isolation, based on the recognition that Europe cannot prosper or remain secure while maintaining hostile relationships with major powers on its periphery. The continued European engagement with Iran, despite American withdrawal from the nuclear agreement and despite American pressure to join maximum pressure campaign, reflects European assessment that preventing Iranian nuclear weapons requires sustained diplomacy rather than coercive isolation that historically has never succeeded in changing behavior of governments that view their survival as dependent on resisting external pressure. The European reluctance to fully embrace American narratives about China's existential threat reflects not naivety about Chinese authoritarian governance or disagreement about the challenges that Chinese economic practices pose, but rather realistic assessment that Europe lacks the power to contain China and that European interests are better served by engagement that shapes Chinese behavior at the margins rather than confrontation that would force China to choose between European demands and its own development trajectory. European leaders understand that China will choose its own trajectory and that European influence depends on maintaining relationships that provide leverage rather than burning bridges in service of American containment strategies that cannot succeed without European participation that would be suicidal for European economic interests. The pattern across economic policy, security strategy, and diplomatic orientation is consistent and reveals the fundamental nature of the transformation underway. European nations are making autonomous decisions based on their assessment of European interests rather than accepting American definitions of Western interests that happen to align with American priorities. This is not anti-Americanism or rejection of shared values, but rather recognition that American and European interests have diverged sufficiently that automatic alignment no longer serves European publics who care more about their own prosperity and security than about maintaining American global dominance. To understand how we arrived at this point of fundamental transatlantic rupture, despite the enormous shared history and institutional integration that was supposed to make the relationship permanent, we must examine the structural changes in global power distribution that have made American hegemony over Europe unsustainable, regardless of the personal relationships between leaders or the diplomatic efforts to maintain alliance. Cohesion, the transatlantic relationship as it existed from 1945 through the end of the Cold War, was predicated on overwhelming American economic and military superiority that made European dependence both necessary and beneficial. The United States provided security guarantees that Europe could not provide for itself, offered access to the largest consumer market in the world, and led the technological innovation that drove post-war growth. In exchange, European nations accepted American leadership, subordinated particular national interests to broader alliance objectives, and provided diplomatic support and basing access that facilitated American global power projection. This arrangement was sustainable as long as the benefits to Europe exceeded the costs of constrained sovereignty and as long as no alternative sources of security or prosperity were available that would provide better outcomes than continued American subordination. Both conditions have eroded dramatically over the past 2 decades. The European Union has created an economic bloc comparable in scale to the United States, reducing European dependence on American markets and creating leverage in economic disputes that did not exist when European nations negotiated individually. The end of the Cold War eliminated the existential Soviet threat that made American protection indispensable, replacing it with a Russia that is considerably weaker and that poses regional rather than global challenges that European capabilities could theoretically address without American participation. Most significantly, the rise of China has created alternative sources of capital, technology, and markets that give European nations options that did not exist during the unipolar moment when alignment with Washington was the only viable path to prosperity. Chinese investment in European infrastructure, Chinese purchases of European exports, Chinese partnerships in technology development. These relationships provide economic benefits that European nations would sacrifice if they fully aligned with American containment policies. The existence of alternatives transforms the transatlantic relationship from necessity to choice, and European governments are making choices based on rational calculation of interests rather than inertial alignment based on historical patterns that no longer serve contemporary needs. The American response to European autonomy has oscillated between efforts at accommodation that attempt to preserve alliance cohesion through consultation and threats of abandonment that attempt to force European compliance through fear of losing American protection. Neither approach addresses the underlying structural reality that European and American interests have diverged and that no amount of diplomatic effort can recreate alignment when the material basis for such alignment no longer exists. The demands that European nations choose between American and Chinese economic relationships, that they increase defense spending to American specified levels regardless of their own threat assessments, that they support American positions on issues from Iran to Israel regardless of European interests. These demands reflect the psychology of a hegemon that cannot accept that its influence has eroded and that attempts to use the leverage it still possesses to forestall the autonomy that structural changes have made inevitable. The tragedy from an American perspective is that this coercive approach to alliance management has accelerated the European drift that it was intended to prevent. Every threat of tariffs strengthens European arguments for economic diversification away from American dependence. Every demand for increased defense spending that exceeds what Europeans believe their security requires reinforces narratives about American manipulation of threat perceptions to sell weapons systems. Every secondary sanction that forces European companies to choose between American and other markets demonstrates that American economic power is wielded coercively against allies and not just against adversaries. The more Washington demands compliance, The more European publics and elites conclude that the transatlantic relationship serves American interests at European expense and that European autonomy is necessary for European prosperity and security. But the transatlantic rupture is merely the kinetic manifestation of a much deeper transformation in the global distribution of power that extends far beyond European-American relations into the fundamental architecture of international order. While Washington focused on maintaining European subordination through institutional inertia and coercive leverage, the actual structure of global power was shifting in ways that render American hegemony over Europe increasingly irrelevant to European strategic calculus. The emergence of a multipolar world where China, India, and regional powers possess sufficient capabilities to shape their own environments means that European security and prosperity depend less on American guarantees and more on Europe's ability to navigate relationships with multiple power centers whose interests do not align and who will not defer to American preferences. European leaders are recognizing that the 21st century international system will not be organized around American dominance and that European interests require flexibility to engage with rising powers on terms that serve European rather than American objectives. The diplomatic initiatives toward China, the continued engagement with Russia despite the Ukraine conflict, the partnerships with India and other emerging economies, these reflect European hedging against a future where American power continues to decline and where European prosperity depends on integration into economic systems that will be centered in Asia rather than across the Atlantic. The global South is watching the European drift away from American alignment with intense interest because European autonomy validates the multipolar vision that developing nations have been articulating for decades. If the wealthiest and most developed American allies are concluding that their interests are better served through strategic autonomy than through continued subordination to American leadership, then the arguments for developing nations to maintain alignment with Washington become even weaker. The proliferation of middle powers pursuing independent foreign policies, the expansion of institutions like BRICS that explicitly reject Western dominance, the increasing willingness of nations to ignore American demands, and to build relationships with countries that Washington has designated as adversaries. All of this reflects the demonstration effect of European autonomy, showing that resistance to American preferences can succeed and that alternatives to American-led order are viable. China has been the primary beneficiary of transatlantic fracture because European economic integration with China proceeds regardless of American objections, and because European diplomatic engagement provides legitimacy to Chinese positions on issues where Washington seeks to isolate Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative succeeds in Europe not because of Chinese coercion, but because European nations assess that infrastructure investment and market access serve their interests better than maintaining solidarity with American containment efforts that would require sacrifice of economic opportunities. The technology partnerships between European and Chinese companies proceed because European firms need access to Chinese markets and Chinese supply chains to remain competitive globally, and because Chinese investment provides capital for projects that European governments cannot fund domestically. Russia has benefited from European recognition that energy security requires relationships with suppliers regardless of political disagreements, and that complete rupture with Moscow would harm European interests more than it would change. Russian behavior. The continued European purchases of Russian energy, even as sanctions were imposed on other sectors, reflected European priority on maintaining access to affordable energy that their industries and populations depend upon. The pressure within Europe to restore fuller economic engagement with Russia once the Ukraine conflict reaches some form of resolution reflects not sympathy for Russian actions, but pragmatic assessment that European prosperity requires stable relationships with neighbors, and that permanent hostility serves no constructive purpose. The consequences of European strategic autonomy are already manifesting in ways that directly affect American power projection and economic dominance. The dollar's role as global reserve currency depends partly on European central banks maintaining substantial dollar reserves and European companies conducting international trade in dollars. As Europe develops alternative payment systems and as European trade increasingly occurs in euros or in local currencies with partners like China, the demand for dollars declines marginally but significantly over time. The cumulative effect of reduced dollar demand is inflationary pressure within the United States, as dollars created through deficit spending can no longer be absorbed by global markets at previous rates. American military bases in Europe that have served as logistics hubs for Middle Eastern and African operations become vulnerable if host nations begin questioning whether continued access serves their interests or unnecessarily entangles them in American conflicts that provide no European benefit. The diplomatic support in international institutions that gave American positions automatic majorities evaporates when European nations vote based on their own interests rather than transatlantic solidarity. The technology sharing and defense industrial cooperation that gave American companies advantaged access to European markets and intellectual property faces restrictions as Europeans prioritize their own industrial development over integration with American supply chains. The institutional manifestation of the new multipolar order that is emerging from European autonomy is the proliferation of regional and functional arrangements that operate outside American influence and that actively exclude American participation. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Continental Free Trade Area. These institutions represent alternative architectures for economic integration, security cooperation, and diplomatic coordination that do not require American approval and that will shape global affairs regardless of American preferences. European participation in or partnership with these non-Western institutions represents the death of the Western-led international order that has governed global affairs since 1945. When Europe engages with Chinese development banks, when European nations join Asian security dialogues, when European companies invest in markets and supply chains that bypass American control, the very concept of the West as a unified geopolitical actor becomes obsolete. What emerges instead is a fluid system of overlapping partnerships where nations pursue their interests through multiple relationships simultaneously rather than through exclusive alignment with one bloc or another. The American foreign policy establishment has shown no capacity to adapt to this new reality, continuing to operate based on assumptions about American indispensability and alliance solidarity that no longer reflect the distribution of power or the interests of putative allies. The demands that allies choose sides in great power competition, the threats to punish nations that maintain relationships with adversaries, the insistence that American security guarantees require absolute alignment with American preferences. These approaches reflect the psychology of a hegemon that cannot accept its own decline and that attempts to use remaining leverage to forestall the autonomy that structural changes have made inevitable. We are standing at a threshold in modern history where the order that has governed international relations for nearly 8 decades is dissolving not through dramatic conflict, but through the quiet recognition among nations that the assumptions underlying that order no longer serve their interests. The transatlantic relationship that was the cornerstone of American global dominance is transforming from hierarchical alliance into partnership of equals, and as that transformation proceeds, American capacity to shape global events through European subordination erodes commensurately. The choice facing American strategy is fundamental and cannot be postponed through diplomatic efforts that maintain appearances while substance dissolves. The first path requires accepting that European strategic autonomy serves American interests by creating a powerful partner that can address regional challenges without requiring American resources, that can engage with China and Russia in ways that serve Western interests broadly defined, even if not aligned precisely with American preferences, and that can provide diplomatic and economic ballast in a multipolar world where American unilateralism is no longer viable. This path requires abandoning the psychology of hegemony and accepting partnership as genuine equals rather than as hierarchy disguised by consultative rhetoric. The second path involves attempting to maintain control over European policy through coercion and threats that would force Europeans to choose between American alignment and their own economic interests. This approach would likely accelerate European drift, destroy remaining goodwill, and result in European nations making exactly the choice that Washington most fears: formal alignment with alternative power centers that can provide markets and security without demanding absolute subordination to external preferences. The third path, which current policy represents, involves denial that the transatlantic relationship has fundamentally changed, maintenance of institutional frameworks and rhetorical commitments that obscure substantive divergence, and hope that European autonomy will prove temporary or that shared values will ultimately overcome divergent interests. This path leads inexorably to continued erosion of American influence, increasing European frustration with American demands that cannot be justified by American contributions to European security or prosperity, and eventual crisis when the gap between appearance and reality becomes so obvious that neither side can maintain the pretense of alliance solidarity. The institutional dynamics suggest that the third path will persist until events force recognition that European autonomy is permanent rather than temporary aberration. Because acknowledging this reality requires abandoning narratives about American leadership and Western unity that serve powerful domestic constituencies whose influence depends on continuation of existing arrangements. The foreign policy establishment benefits from maintenance of alliances that justify their expertise in institutional positions. Defense contractors profit from security relationships that generate equipment sales. Political leaders use alliance solidarity to demonstrate foreign policy success. These constituencies create overwhelming pressure to deny that fundamental change has occurred, even as evidence accumulates that the transatlantic relationship has transformed beyond recognition. This channel exists to analyze how power actually shifts in alliance relationships rather than accepting official narratives that obscure transformation behind diplomatic language. We examine the structural forces driving strategic autonomy and the institutional pathologies that prevent adaptation to changed realities. The algorithm suppresses this content because it challenges comfortable myths about Western unity that serve institutional interests in maintaining influence regardless of effectiveness. If you want to understand how the international order is being transformed by the emergence of genuine multipolarity, if you refuse to accept propaganda that portrays alliance friction as temporary disagreements rather than fundamental divergence of interests, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Do not let them keep you ignorant about the transformation that is ending the era of American hegemony and creating the world that your children will inherit. I want to hear your analysis in the comments below. First, do you believe the transatlantic alliance can survive the fundamental divergence of interests between the United States and Europe? Or has European strategic autonomy become irreversible such that the partnership will dissolve formally over the coming decade? Second, as Europe pursues independent relationships with China and other rising powers, will this multipolar engagement serve European interests better than continued alignment with American preferences that often conflict with European economic and security needs? Write your answers below. I will be reading them. Stay vigilant